comes forward against Republican Senate candidate Roy Moore. His campaign calls it all a witch hunt, but more Republicans in Congress are calling on the candidate to step down. This is Special Report. Good evening. Welcome to Washington. I'm Bret Baier. Another woman has come forward this afternoon claiming Republican Senate candidate Roy Moore sexually assaulted her when she was a minor. This accuser claims Moore tried to rape her when she was 16. The accusation is another blow to Moore's campaign, which is feeling the heat as more and more Republicans, including the Senate Majority Leader, call on him to step aside in this race. At this hour, Moore and his campaign stand firm, saying he's innocent. He'll continue to fight all of these accusations and that this is all made up by the Washington swamp, afraid of his election. Correspondent Jonathan Serry reports from Moore's hometown.
I was terrified. He was also trying to pull my shirt off. I thought that he was going to rape me.
Flanked by attorney Gloria Allred, a new accuser came forward, claiming Roy Moore sexually assaulted her 40 years ago, shortly after she turned 16. The Moore campaign responded, saying Gloria Allred is a sensationalist leading a witch hunt. Judge Moore is an innocent man and has never had any sexual misconduct with anyone. Today, Senate Majority Leader Mitch McConnell said he believes Moore's accusers.
Are you calling for him to step down from that Senate race?
I did. I think he should step aside.
McConnell joins a growing number of Republicans who are pulling their support or calling on Moore to leave the race.
I think the accusations have more credibility than the denial. I think it would be best if Roy would just step aside.
The latest developments come less than 24 hours after Moore told a group in Huntsville he planned legal action against the Washington Post for publishing allegations he made sexual advances on a 14-year-old girl back in 1979 when he was 32.
These attacks involve a minor child, completely false and untrue, and for which they will be sued.
Roy Moore accuses the Republican establishment and Democrats of fueling the allegations to derail his campaign. His opponent, former U.S. Attorney Doug Jones, says his campaign had nothing to do with the allegations.
Absolutely not. Absolutely not. That's just another in a continuing pattern of absurd statements that Moore and his campaign have made, not just in the course of this campaign, but in the course of his career.
And Brett, Senate Democrats are looking at a possible pickup, but for now they're waiting on Jones to ask their help. Minority Leader Chuck Schumer says the Jones campaign is running on its own. And we have some late breaking news. Arizona Senator John McCain says Moore should not be allowed to sit in the Senate, that he should be expelled, not seated, quote, by any means possible. Brett?
Jonathan Serry live in Alabama. Jonathan, thank you. With growing calls for Moore to step down, tonight we take a look at what lawmakers could possibly do if he does not withdraw from this race.
The party is talking about its candidate and whether or not its candidate should appear on, or how its candidate should appear on the ballot, whether it's Mr. Moore or someone else.
Option one being considered by those who want to see Judge Moore step aside, delay the special election, currently set for December 12th. Alabama Governor Kay Ivey would order a new date for the election, likely early next year, allowing time to ease Moore out of the race. Judge Moore has said he's fighting this, and the governor's spokesman so far says she has no plans to do it.
What about the notion that is being discussed with these new revelations, the governor of Alabama delaying the special election next month?
Look, we all know that Alabama is a very tough state politically for Democrats, but this is a special situation where we have a great candidate. On the other hand, you have a very, very flawed candidate in Roy Moore, which is why many people are calling upon him to step down.
To replace Moore on the ballot, Alabama election law requires candidates to withdraw at least 76 days before an election, a deadline that's already come and gone.
There is the possibility that the party could, pursuant to its own rules, petition to have Roy Moore taken off the ballot. But again, that would be a relatively extraordinary situation, but that's not to say it wouldn't happen. But by and large, at this point in the game, Roy Moore does have the advantage.
Option two, exclusion from office, which has not succeeded in the courts in the past on the grounds that Moore does not meet constitutional requirements for office. Senate Majority Leader Mitch McConnell could contest Moore's fitness for office and block him from being seated under Article 1, Section 5 of the Constitution. There are also reports citing senior White House sources that are suggesting Governor Ivey could block Moore if he wins and then appoint Attorney General Jeff Sessions to what had once been his Senate seat. Justice Department officials say Sessions has no interest in going back to being Alabama senator. The final option, expulsion, seating a victorious Moore in the Senate and then quickly kicking him out. 2/3 of the Senate would have to vote to expel him, a steep hurdle since Democrats would likely enjoy any chaos and to also have Moore as an issue in 2020. The last successful expulsion was in 1862. And experts don't expect it would work this time around.
It's unlikely that the Senate would not recognize a duly elected U.S. senator simply because there was a political scandal that might have changed the outcome of the election.
But NRSC Chairman Senator Cory Gardner called for Moore's expulsion today should he win, saying in a statement, quote, if he refuses to withdraw and wins, the Senate should vote to expel him because he does not meet the ethical and moral requirements of the United States Senate. Adding to the confusion, Alabama has what's called a sore losers law, which means that primary opponents Luther Strange and Mo Brooks would not be able to be on the ballot. So a write-in campaign would be the only way they would go forward. President Trump's trip to Asia is winding down, but there's no doubt it's been busy. Over the weekend, the president made a few headlines for what he did or did not say to the Philippines leader, and in another case, how what President Trump said about Vladimir Putin was reported by the media. Chief White House correspondent John Roberts has the story.
It was the most controversial of the many meetings he has had in the past 11 days. President Trump sitting down with Philippines President Rodrigo Duterte.
We've had a great relationship. This has been very successful.
Duterte has presided over an aggressive drug war in the Philippines, marked by thousands of extrajudicial killings, though Duterte denies any involvement. The White House says President Trump briefly brought up human rights during the bilateral meeting, but a spokesman for Duterte immediately contradicted that.
There was no mention of human rights. There was no mention of extralegal killings.
Despite the disagreement over what was discussed, Duterte's people say the relationship with President Trump is warm and friendly. And at the ASEAN dinner, Duterte sang a love song with a famous Filipino pop star, saying he did it on orders from President Trump.
The orders of the Commander-in-Chief of the United States.
North Korea was high on the agenda as the president met again with Shinzo Abe of Japan and Australian Prime Minister Malcolm Turnbull. Last week, Abe pledged 100% support to President Trump. In Manila, it was Turnbull's turn.
We've got the same values and the same focus on ensuring that the North Korean regime comes to its senses and stops its reckless provocation and threats of conflict in our region.
President Trump promised a big announcement on North Korea when he returns to the White House on Wednesday, and something on trade, too.
We made a lot of big progress on trade. We have deficits with almost everybody. Those deficits are going to be cut very quickly and very substantially.
Except us.
You're the only one.
The only glitch in the trip came after the APEC summit in Vietnam. President Trump revealing that Russian President Vladimir Putin had again assured him he had nothing to do with meddling in the U.S. election. Asked aboard Air Force One whether he believed Putin, the president said, quote, I really believe that when he tells me that, he means it. Some reports took that to mean President Trump believed what Putin said over U.S. intelligence assessments that Russia did indeed interfere.
John Roberts of Fox, please.
At a press conference in Hanoi, Fox News asked the president to clarify.
Could you once and for all definitively, sir, yes or no, say whether or not you believe that President Putin and or Russia interfered in the election?
What I said there is that I believe he believes that, and that's very important for somebody to believe. I believe that he feels that he and Russia did not meddle in the election. As to whether I believe it or not, I'm with our agencies.
President Trump added that he trusts the intelligence agencies with their current leadership, the leadership that he put in. And while he didn't definitively say that he thinks that President Putin is not telling the truth when he says he did not meddle in the U.S. election. It certainly appears to be, Brett, as close as he's ever come to saying that.
John Roberts traveling with the president in Manila early Tuesday morning. John, thank you. We're learning tonight President Trump's son, Don Jr., communicated with WikiLeaks at the height of his father's presidential campaign, and that communication continued well into this summer. The Atlantic reports that the transparency organization private messaged Trump Jr. on Twitter asking the president's son for his cooperation in sharing its work, in contesting the results of the election should his father lose, and after Trump's election, helping Julian Assange to become Australia's ambassador to the U.S. The messages were given to congressional investigators, and lawmakers are already now weighing in on Capitol Hill.
President's son would be in direct communication with the vehicle that was used by Russia in order to seek to influence our election is a really striking development.
You think that means that flies in the face of what was said in Asia by the president?
It's certainly close coordination.
We'll continue to follow this story as it develops. Trump attorney Ty Cobb tells Fox News there is no legal issue with those messages. It is the beginning of one hectic week on Capitol Hill that could end as one of the most successful legislative weeks since President Trump took office, or it could end up looking a lot like the Obamacare repeal efforts that failed dramatically earlier this year. Chief Congressional Correspondent Mike Emanuel reports from Capitol Hill tonight on the tax reform push.
It's the start of a critical week in Congress on tax reform. House GOP leaders are expected to whip their Republican members this evening to see if they have the votes for tax reform. Though they're optimistic, conservative members have questions.
Does it actually cut taxes? Will it simplify the code? And will it be conducive to producing economic growth? If the answer to those three questions are yes, then we should be for it.
Committee will come to order.
There's also action on the other side of the Capitol with the Finance Committee working on the Senate tax plan.
With regard to the middle-class tax cut, it's real. The Joint Committee on Taxation, which is the nonpartisan group up on the Hill, just came out with their analysis over the weekend, and it shows that middle-class families across the board get tax relief.
On the Senate side, with 52 Republicans, the challenge once again will be keeping the GOP unified. Bob Corker of Tennessee, Jeff Flake of Arizona, and James Lankford of Oklahoma have expressed concerns about the nation's debt. So GOP leaders will need to assure them that this tax package won't blow a hole in the deficit. Then there's Marco Rubio of Florida and Mike Lee of Utah, who want to double the child tax credit, boosted to $2,000. The Senate plan would increase it to $1,650, and they aren't satisfied. President Trump today reiterated his call for including a tax in Obamacare, tweeting, "Now how about ending the unfair and highly unpopular individual mandate in Obamacare and reducing taxes even further? Cut top rate to 35%, with all the rest going to middle-income cuts." Senate Democratic leader Chuck Schumer suggests that would sell out most folks who voted for the president.
Congressional Republicans are doing their best to put their majorities at risk. If Republicans thought it was hard winning elections last week with the drag of an unpopular president weighing them down, wait till the voters hear about this bill.
Including the individual mandate of Obamacare would certainly add revenue, and some sources suggest it could add votes in the House, but might lose votes in the Senate, where the challenge remains getting 50 to yes. Brett?
Mike Emanuel live on the Hill. Mike, thanks. For more analysis on the current state of tax reform, we turn to senior political analyst Bret Hume. Good evening, Bret. You just heard Mike's piece. Your thoughts?
Hi, Brett. Well, I think my sense is that there's a level of determination on this that transcends the level they had on their failed effort to repeal Obamacare, and that they will probably, one way or another, find a way to get this done. But there's a kind of an inescapable trap, Brett, that proponents of tax cuts, usually Republicans, end up in when the debate is on. And that is this: the principal economic reason for passing tax cuts is not the individual benefits that will accrue to people who save money on their tax bills. It is the overall effect on the economy, the belief that you get a big growth boost out of this that helps everybody at all income levels, or at least can help everybody at all income levels. That's the best reason for doing it economically. But inevitably, the discussion turns to how much this taxpayer or that taxpayer gets in savings. And that leads inevitably to questions about whether the middle income people are being shafted and the rich people are benefiting. And that, of course, Brett, comes down to this. Who pays the overwhelming share of the taxes in this country? It's the people in the upper income brackets. Therefore, they stand to benefit more because they pay more. And they pay not only more in taxes, but a higher percentage in taxes than people at the lower levels do. And the result, of course, is that you end up with this debate about whether this is a tax cut for the rich or not, which is Democratic territory, and Republicans find themselves fighting on that ground, which is not advantageous to them.
Which is what we're seeing, Brett, between the House and the Senate version. And the going bet on Capitol Hill is that the Senate version, which does not have the estate tax, or some call the death tax, in it, and also has 7 different brackets still, is more likely to be where they end up after conference. But the key point is you have to get it to that conference meeting.
Well, that's exactly right. And of course, you know, what you end up doing is you end up trying to design a tax cut that benefits people who don't pay much in taxes. It's got this huge percentage, Brett, of American income taxpayers who don't pay any income tax at all, because over the years, as Republicans and their allies have passed tax cuts, the prices they've paid for doing that is lopping more and more people off the tax rolls altogether. So you have a huge chunk of the populace that really has no stake in tax cuts. Now, they don't care what I'm talking about income tax cuts, of course. They don't really care what level the income taxes go to because they don't pay them.
Yeah,
and
but the administration
somehow you've got to get those.
They would say that because you would be stirring up the engine, that they would therefore benefit by the economy.
Oh, I agree with that. But that's that argument that the growth that's stimulated, that's caused by tax cuts, that indirect benefit that people receive, it's hard to quantify ahead of time, so it's hard to make the argument. And that is why, to some extent, tax cuts, which are broadly speaking popular, do face, when you get down to who gets what, the who gets what argument is disadvantageous to those who are promoting them, because inevitably you end up trying to design a tax cut for people who don't pay much in taxes. Hard to do. And it's awfully hard to do in a way that, if you're cutting a tax cut of any size, is bound to benefit the people who pay more, or else it's not going to be a tax cut of any size. It's a dilemma, but it's the political equation we're looking at here, Brett. You'll see it played out time and again as we go forward here.
Brett, as always, thank you. We'll see how House Speaker Paul Ryan's elevator pitch on this is tomorrow in a town hall. We'll air here on Special Report and Into the Story. Again, with Martha McCallum, House Speaker Paul Ryan talking tax reform. Brett, thank you. President Trump is tapping a former pharmaceutical executive to be his next Health and Human Services Secretary. The president tweeted out that he nominated Alex Azar to head the agency, saying he will be a star for better health care and lower drug prices. Azar spent much of the last 10 years with pharmaceutical giant Eli Lilly, but also served in posts with HHS under the George W. Bush administration. Next up, the probe into the death of a Green Beret takes a new turn. As we learn the Navy SEALs under investigation were already on the radar for another possible crime. More than 400 people are dead following a 7.3 magnitude earthquake Sunday night along the border of Iraq and Iran. Thousands more are injured, we're told. At this hour, rescuers continue to dig through the debris from buildings brought down by this natural disaster in hopes of finding more survivors. 4 U.S. service members were wounded in a suicide attack on their convoy in Afghanistan's Kandahar province today. An Army spokesman tells Fox News the troops are in stable condition. The Taliban has already claimed responsibility for that attack. The nuclear threat from North Korea has obviously been a big topic of discussion during much of President Trump's trip through Asia. But as senior foreign affairs correspondent Greg Palcott reports, along with the tough talk comes a show of force. One the defense secretary insisted this evening is just standard operating procedure.
It is an armada of U.S. naval firepower coming at a time of high tension with North Korea. For the first time in nearly 50 years, 3 U.S. aircraft carriers on maneuvers off the Korean peninsula. USS Nimitz, Ronald Reagan, and Theodore Roosevelt in action, along with some 70 aircraft on each carrier, destroyers, guided missile warships, submarines, and other vessels. Aimed at sending a message to the Kim Jong-un regime and its banned nuclear and missile program. Joining in the 4-day exercise in the Sea of Japan, ships from Japan and South Korea.
On the basis of our robust alliance, we will deter the enemy's provocations.
And on land, a dramatic scene today at the tense demilitarized zone between North and South Korea. A North Korean soldier in the joint security area staged a brave defection. He was shot and injured by North Korean forces, then rescued by South Korean troops.
Our military has secured the safety of the soldier and quickly transported the soldier to a hospital for treatment of injuries.
While there are some 1,000 defections a year from North Korea, flights across the DMZ are rare. Even more rare, defections by Americans into North Korea. Elsewhere along the DMZ, an unnamed 58-year-old man from Louisiana tried to get across, authorities say for political purposes. He didn't get far and is now held by South Koreans. All this as President Trump concludes an Asian trip with North Korea a main focus. Following meetings with Chinese President Xi, President Trump said China's leader would increase sanctions against Pyongyang.
We are committed to realizing denuclearization, maintaining peace and stability on the peninsula, and solving problems through dialogue and consultation.
For its part, Pyongyang branded the U.S. a heinous force for aggression, and President Trump a war maniac. The president's trip apparently not doing much for any hoped-for friendship with Kim Jong-un. Bret.
Greg Palcott in London. Greg, thanks. The death of 4 U.S. soldiers in Niger last month is raising red flags back here at home, as eyewitnesses give their accounts of how they found Sergeant LaDavid Johnson 2 days after the ambush-style attack. This is military investigators are now on the ground in the country to gain a better understanding of what happened that night. Correspondent Kristen Fisher reports tonight on what we're learning in this case.
Investigators back on the ground in Tonga Tonga trying to get answers about the attack that killed 4 U.S. troops last month. One U.S. official in Niger says a very large U.S. team spent most of the day Sunday collecting information while drones monitored their movements overhead. According to U.S. Africa Command, the team interviewed local villagers, conducted a physical examination of multiple areas of interest related to the attack, and retraced actions leading up to, during, and after this ambush. It was 2 of those villagers who reportedly told the Washington Post that the body of Sergeant LaDavid Johnson was, quote, found with his arms tied and a gaping wound at the back of his head, according to 2 villagers, suggesting that he may have been captured and then executed, though the Pentagon won't confirm it. The villagers' accounts come amid growing scrutiny on Capitol Hill.
Thanks.
All right. Republicans and Democrats continue to be concerned about what they describe as insufficient or conflicting information about the deadliest combat operation since President Trump took office. True for Congresswoman Frederica Wilson, who listened in on Mr. Trump's condolence call with Sergeant Johnson's widow.
I had a very nice conversation.
After the Post story broke, she says she was surprised to wake up to the horrific details in the report, adding, quote, I'm very concerned about the mysterious circumstances surrounding Sergeant Johnson's death, and I need and want answers now. But so far today, still no answers when the Defense Secretary James Mattis was asked point blank this afternoon, was Sergeant Johnson executed? He replied, we're still waiting on the investigation, and that won't be complete until January, Bret.
We'll continue to follow it here. Kristen, thank you. The Green Beret, killed in Mali earlier this year, reportedly made a discovery that may have led to his murder. But the 2 Navy SEALs being investigated in that murder and Staff Sergeant Logan Melgar's death say they actually tried to save his life. National Security Correspondent Jennifer Griffin has been following this case, joins us now from the Pentagon with the latest. Good evening, Jennifer.
Good evening, Bret. We are learning the 2 SEALs, members of the elite SEAL Team 6, were already under suspicion prior to this mysterious death of the Green Beret. They were alleged to have been involved in skimming cash from an informant's fund that the team used as part of a secret counterterrorism mission in Mali. Staff Sergeant Logan Melgar, 34, was strangled to death at 5 a.m. on June 4th. The medical examiner ruled it homicide by asphyxiation. The 2 Navy SEALs at first reportedly said that Melgar had been drinking when they took him to the hospital. The problem is Staff Sergeant Melgar didn't drink, and he had told his wife Michelle that he was having trouble with these 2 SEALs in emails back home. Almost immediately, his superiors suspected homicide, we're told. Red flags were raised when the autopsy report came back and said that there was no sign of alcohol or drugs in Melgar's bloodstream. That's when the SEALs SEALs' alibi began to fall apart. Melgar was murdered at the U.S. Embassy housing in the Mali capital, where he and the SEALs were staying. Their commander at AFRICOM headquarters in Stuttgart immediately ordered an investigation. Staff Sergeant Melgar was a highly regarded member of the Army's 3rd Special Forces Group. He was handpicked for the mission. The embassy staff and ambassador respected him. One of the SEALs is said to be a mixed martial arts specialist. NCIS, the Navy's Criminal Investigative Service, took over the investigation from the Army in September, Brett.
Jennifer Griffin live at the Pentagon. Jennifer, thank you. Biden 2020, the former vice president won't rule out a run for president, but next, how Democrats are looking at that possible Biden ticket in 2020. Former Vice President Joe Biden has been quiet for a while, but now he's back with a new book on an intensely personal subject and some hints about whether he may resume his former line of work. Here's Chief Washington correspondent James Rosen.
Less than a week after Donna Brazil's new book revealed that the interim DNC chair considered replacing Hillary Clinton with Vice President Joe Biden as the 2016 Democratic nominee following Clinton's dramatic fainting spell that September, Mr. Biden has a new book of his own out, Promise Me Dad, about his son Beau's death from cancer. And he wants you to know Donna Brazil's idea would never have worked.
I was not ready in terms of my family, so no, I would never have done that.
Mr. Biden, who turns 75 next week, says he hasn't made up his mind about 2020.
I'm in good shape, knock on wood, as my mother would say. But, you know, I just don't know. I honest to God, that's the truth.
There'll be this tension within the party of what type of candidates to nominate. People with no previous government experience, like the current president, or people with a lot of government experience, like a Joe Biden or someone else.
Mr. Biden also argued Hillary Clinton lost because she could not get the message out about the middle class.
He's absolutely right about this. We would have plans to roll out, a huge policy that she was unveiling on health care, on jobs, on education, on a range of issues, and then we would be derailed by something that that candidate at the time, Trump, did.
Were Mr. Biden to re-enter the fray, he would find his party frayed by Brazil's allegation that the DNC rigged last year's primary.
I'm here to fight for everybody whose voice needs to be heard.
Massachusetts Senator Elizabeth Warren, a potential 2020 contender, agrees the primary was rigged, but told reporters outside a town hall Sunday the party has come together.
I wanted to try to get a reaction on the Brazil revelation this morning, Mr. Sanders.
Yet Bernie Sanders, the independent Vermont senator who captured 43% of Democratic primary votes last year, portrayed the party as doomed if it does not expand to include unaffiliated voters.
Say to young people who are overwhelmingly independent, say to working people, we don't want you to come into the Democratic Party. Is totally absurd, and it's a recipe for failure.
Democrats are also disagreeing over how to interpret the data from the elections they won last week. This week, euphoria having subsided, a number of analysts are observing that the party did not show strong growth outside of traditional Democratic strongholds such as big cities. Brett?
James, thank you. More on this with the panel. The markets end the day in the green. The Dow was up 17.5. The S&P 500 rose 2.5. The Nasdaq was up nearly 7. Jurors say they cannot reach a verdict in the corruption trial of Democratic Senator Bob Menendez. But the judge said today, go home, get some fresh air, try again tomorrow morning. Jurors started from scratch today after one juror was replaced at the end of deliberations last week for a pre-planned vacation. Up next, what to do with Roy Moore. Our panel weighs in.
I think he should step aside.
Are you encouraging a write-in campaign by Senator Strange?
That's an option we're looking at, whether or not there is someone who could mount a write-in campaign successfully.
Or do you believe these allegations to be true?
I believe the women, yes.
3 days ago, the Washington Post published another attack on my character reputation and desperate to stop my political campaign. These attacks involve a minor child, completely false and untrue, and for which they will be sued.
Another accuser coming out today saying that Judge Roy Moore attempted, she said, to rape her when she was 16. Judge Moore tweeting out, in addition to what he said there, the person who should step aside is Senate Majority Leader Mitch McConnell. He has failed conservatives and must be replaced. Drain the swamp as the calls increase for Moore to step aside out of this race in Alabama. Luther Strange, who ran against Judge Moore in the primary just moments ago, made a comment outside the Capitol to gathered press there, expecting specifics soon. But basically, he said the allegations are very serious. It's up to the people of Alabama to make sense of all of this and decide how they want to proceed. Asked about ruling out running, he called it an unfolding story and did not want to get into speculation. Alabama, as I told you earlier, has what's called a sore loser law, so he lost the primary, as did Mo Brooks. Neither one of them could be on a ballot, but they could launch a write-in campaign there. Let's bring in our panel. Steve Hayes, editor-in-chief of the Weekly Standard. Mara Liasson, national political correspondent of National Public Radio. And Molly Hemingway, senior editor at The Federalist. Okay, Molly, every day, obviously this is another iteration of what we're learning, more accusations, and more Republicans really coming out saying this should come to an end, this race.
Yeah. So after the news on Friday, it was kind of interesting to see what happens now. And today we have yet another very sickening allegation about improper behavior, assault against a minor. And it's very difficult to report on these stories and respond to these stories when you're dealing with not just the sensitivity of the issues, but how to know what really happened. But it's not surprising that a lot of people are finding that this is still a problem, that more stories are coming out, and this is not good for Roy Moore. He has denied, but he kind of equivocated in some of his denial, which is not giving people a lot of confidence. So what I'm kind of interested in is this is all happening while Donald Trump is on an Asia tour. He did not support Roy Moore during the primary. He said he would support him as the winner of the primary. I'm kind of curious what he'll do when he returns. I have a feeling he would not enjoy that this is happening, and he might weigh in, and that might be what is decisive in this case.
Listen, Mara, Alabama is deep red in its inclinations politically. If there was a write-in campaign, it would have to be somebody big to be enough to overtake somebody who was actually on the ballot.
Yep, because if it wasn't big, it might just corral all those Republicans who've been flirting with voting for the Democrat, and then they have somewhere to park, and Roy Moore could still win. If it wasn't somebody so big that could literally win in a three-way race.
Or the Democrat wins with
Or the Democrat wins. So what I'm saying is that the write-in idea is fraught with peril. You got to get the right person if the Republicans are planning to have that person, win the race. So that's very tough. But the one clue for Donald Trump, and I think Molly's right, what's he going to do when he comes home? Kellyanne Conway was pretty tough this weekend about Roy Moore. She didn't say if these are true. She said this is the kind of thing that is, somebody should not be in the Senate with this kind of behavior. That might be a clue as to what Donald Trump is going to do when he gets back.
Steve Bannon does not feel that way. He's been out and about talking on different outlets, and let's take a listen to this weekend.
It's just like Billy Bush weekend. It's just like this thing down there with Judge Moore. It's just like on this. They're petrified of the opposition party. The Republican Party and the leaders of the Republican Party
personally
are
bragging
cowards.
about killing people.
You're writing your
ISIS
checks to
created a new
Understand
spectrum
this.
of evil.
They're there for you when it's easy.
Duterte used to be
They're there
here,
to take
but
your
ISIS
check.
came along. So
Not
now
sure how
you
the
gotta,
room responded
maybe
to that whole
you got to
argument,
use this
but,
guy.
that is the argument he's making.
Rodrigo.
Well, I guess I'm not
to deal
surprised
with
that that's the
worser
argument
evil
that he's making. He's the one who gave a career to Milo Yiannopoulos, who writes for Breitbart,
So I think
had
that Trump
defended
dealing with
similar
Putin,
kinds of
dealing
things in the
with,
past. So now you've got Steve Bannon defending somebody who I think has been credibly accused
reflects a greater idea that he has
assaulting
about evil in the
interesting
world. He knows that these
girls.
guys may not be the
did the same
greatest
thing with
people, they might even be
Yiannopoulos.
thugs,
He didn't defend
but for
him,
now,
but he certainly boosted
we
his
have
career
to
and
use
stood
them
by
in
him.
order to
To
fight
me,
this
the real
existential
question, I think the
apocalyptic evil,
Republicans
which
are
is
likely
terror.
to get
The enemy
behind
of my enemy
somebody
is
for
my
a writing
friend, I think
campaign.
they
I think
said.
the big
I
decision
said that
came
was
today
you.
where they decided we are not going to have anything to do with Roy Moore from this point forward.
having made that
NRSC
saying that, Mitch McConnell's comments, I think the real question is who they get behind, who they're recruiting. And you can be sure that over on the other side of Capitol Hill, they're making phone calls furiously to try to enlist somebody who they think, even in the event of a Doug Jones win, of a Republican loss, could carry the banner of sort of credible conservatism in this race in a way that Roy Moore just can't.
All right, so one idea that's been floated out there, and the New York Times had a piece on about this. One idea now being discussed under this scenario, brought up by two different White House officials who spoke on condition of anonymity, would be for Governor Kay Ivey of Alabama to immediately appoint Attorney General Jeff Sessions to what had been his seat when it becomes vacant again. Mr. Sessions remains highly popular among Alabama Republicans, but his relationship with President Trump has waned since he recused himself from the investigation of the role that Russia played in last year's campaign. I don't know if that's wishful thinking by some inside the White House, or I know the Justice Department has said privately that Sessions has no interest in going back to his Senate seat in Alabama. Whether he has a say or not, we don't know.
It's interesting that that came from two White House sources, because that might give us an indication of where Trump is leaning. It's also interesting that Sessions, or that the Department of Justice said that Sessions has no interest in that. This is a plan that only works if Sessions, for some reason, wants to go back to the Senate. But it's absolutely true that Republican leaders do need to think about the Republican voter. And I don't know if they find it as persuasive that it's okay to give this seat up to Democrats as Republicans here in Washington, D.C. think. I don't think people are that committed to Roy Moore, but they're probably very committed to keeping that seat Republican, and they would like to see what happens when Republicans win an Alabama Senate seat.
Because the Senate math gets a little dicey when you start adding up 2018 in some of these states without Alabama. Speaking of the Justice Department will not rule out, we're being told, opening another special counsel investigation into Uranium One and the Clinton Foundation. Fox News has learned that Attorney General Jeff Sessions has directed senior federal prosecutors to evaluate certain issues requested by congressional Republicans involving the sale of Uranium One and alleged unlawful dealings related to the Clinton Foundation. The letter to the House Judiciary Committee directs senior federal prosecutors to evaluate these issues raised and will make recommendations as to whether any matters not currently under investigation should be opened or investigated further. So a little breaking news late this evening. Next up, Biden in 2020. We'll discuss the ups and downs of a possible run by the former VP after the break.
Are you in the race for 2020?
Look, I can tell you honestly, if the Lord Almighty came down, sat in the middle of the table and said, Joe, the nomination is yours, but you have to take it now, I would say no, not now.
Why?
Because I'm not ready. My dad had another expression. He'd say, Joey, don't compare me to the Almighty, compare me to the alternative. I think the reason I'm looking good now is the alternative.
All told, that's a pretty remarkable legacy, an amazing career in public service. It is, as Joe once said, a big deal.
Left out a word there, but Joe Biden, former vice president, considering, not ruling it out, a run in 2020. Meantime, Saturday Night Live had some fun with the fresh faces of the Democrats.
We're back, baby. The Dems are back. Estamos de vuelta. You love us again.
And we haven't felt this confident since the day before Trump won.
You love our fresh new ideas delivered by fresh new faces like me, Nancy Pelosi.
And me, Dianne Feinstein.
And me, Chuck Schumer.
Y yo soy Tim Kaine.
And I'm team player Donna Brazil.
It's Biden time. And I'm still around too.
So there you get the sense of it. We're back with the panel. Okay, Mara.
Well, Joe Biden was somebody who everyone thought's time had come and gone, and now maybe it's coming around again. You know, people are looking at him and saying, he's authentic in his own kind of bumbly way. He can speak to white working class voters, and he might be old. He's 75, but he looks pretty darn good, really good shape.
Yeah, so
he has that kind of return to normalcy, believe it or not, in the era of Trump, where normalcy has been redefined.
So, looking at the facts now, he turns 75 next Monday. Elected to the Senate at age 29, fifth youngest to the Senate. Served 36 years, including 8 years as chairman of the Judiciary Committee, 4 years of foreign relations. Ran for president 88, 2007, obviously, 8 years as vice president. If you look at the latest poll that looks into Biden against Donald Trump, he does well, according to the poll. That's October 10th, back in 2015. That's a long time ago.
Yeah, it is a long time ago. Look, I think that the question for Joe Biden isn't necessarily age so much as his ideology. The center of gravity in the Democratic Party has shifted dramatically to the left, far left of where Joe Biden was. Now, he may be able to reposition himself a bit by arguing that he was Barack Obama's vice president and Obama moved the party to the left, but we're talking about people who are, in Bernie Sanders' case, a socialist, in Elizabeth Warren's case, a near-socialist. That's who the Democratic base is excited by today. Do they get excited by Joe Biden and his sort of old school, New Deal Democratic politics? I'm not sure.
Democrats love him. I will say this. Grassroots Democrats, ideology aside, they love Joe Biden.
By the way, I should point out, that was not, I thought that this last poll was recent. It was from 2015, so it's not really even a factor because it's before Trump became Trump and obviously before he became president. So disregard that Fox poll from 2015. But up against Donald Trump, and especially with white working class voters in places like Michigan, Wisconsin, all of those blue collar states. What do you think?
Yeah, I think mostly what we're seeing right now is just a continued realization that Hillary Clinton was a very bad candidate to run last year. And I think people have a little bit of remorse that they couldn't get Biden to run. He would have done very well against Donald Trump. But building on what Steve says, the question for the Democratic Party is really, do they want to try and recapture some of that blue-collar vote that they lost so clearly with the Trump election and what they've been losing really going back for several years, or do they want to lean into the identity politics? And a lot of people see, just in terms of sheer raw numbers, if they could appeal more to white working-class voters, they could do pretty well in the presidential. But that is not the direction that the party is really going. The direction the party is going is to really lean into identity politics, and you saw that even, in the recent success that they had in Virginia.
I mean, who else is leading the party? Who else is you're talking about as the next Democrat?
There isn't one right now, and it's ridiculous to talk about 2020 right now. There are a ton of people who want to run, and then there's Joe Biden. In other words, it's kind of like a bunch of, I don't want to call them pygmies, but there are a bunch of people, and then there's Joe Biden. He's the only one right now with that kind of stature. And Molly's put out the choice for Democrats pretty well, but I think the story of Virginia was they have to reach out to white working class voters because they got their voters out, but they didn't make inroads into those Trump areas. And maybe that works in Virginia. It's not going to work in Wisconsin, Michigan, Ohio, et cetera.
Well, I think Mara's caveat is the right one here. I mean, Joe Biden looks big and looks formidable in these circumstances right now, this far removed. But he is an establishment Democrat. We are in an anti-establishment mood, and it's both political parties.
When we come back, honoring the Sin Sil 7.